Hello. A year ago, I created a series of videos about collage, which is something I do love, and I did it in this room. It is something that I love, but my true obsession is with how stories work. And so I have a bunch of videos on YouTube that are about collage, but then I was thinking I needed to talk about this my ideas about how stories work, because this is something I have been obsessed with for years now. This is my cat, Bo. Um, she wants to be in the video. Um, uh, Partly because I wanted to know the answers of, basic things like how stories work, and I never really could get the answers. My MFA didn't really teach it to me. Textbooks don't really teach it to me. So I strove to figure it out myself. And so I came up with these ideas of how stories work. And so I wanted to make sure to record them, because I keep hoping for a chance to be able to teach them to people one day, but I worry that I'll never get that chance. And so I created this visual, sort of combining the collage and the concept of how stories work into one, just as a visual to explain these basic concepts. And so, just worrying that I would never get the chance to actually teach that, I wanted to make sure to record it. And I thought about writing something. This is my dog Siku. I wanted to write something, but I always run across the conflict of, do I actually want to write a story, or do I want to write all this down? And so I always struggle with sort of the inroads of how to actually get started, what sort of examples to use. And I thought of doing a series of videos, sort of like the collage videos I did a year ago. And the first one I thought of doing, because part of my motivation for recording all of these ideas is carpe diem. I have Crohn's disease. There's always a, sort of a consciousness of never knowing quite how long I have left. I know my mother would hate to hear me talk about that, but it is a consciousness I have. So am I ever going to be able to teach this to people before, Crohn's disease finishes me off? But anyway, so it's kind of a macabre motivation. But thinking of all of that, the example that I thought of using was the work of Robin Williams, because it is close to the 5-year anniversary of his death. And one of his most significant parts was in Good Will Hunting. Not Good Will Hunting, yeah, well, that was too, but in Dead Poets Society. Those kind of mashed together in my mind for some reason. And Dead Poets Society and Good Will Hunting are really not my favorite ones, but those are two of his most celebrated pieces. I used to love Dead Poets Society more than I do anymore. But I thought that would be a good example. Bo is about to knock the camera down. I thought that would function as an example just to get into the ideas of the rainbow circle, which is the diagram that I came up with to explain my basic concepts of how stories work, how fiction works. I write fiction, but you can use this for any sort of story. You can actually use this for any art form, period. But the way the rainbow circle works is it is a spectrum. And I think that's the important thing to remember when assessing any art form. I'm surrounded by animals right now, and they're all going to knock everything over any second now. The important thing to remember when assessing any sort of art form, in the practical mode of creating an art form, creating a piece of art or what have you, a lot of the times this is Maggie. They're all going to get on camera eventually. And in creating any sort of art form, it's important to remember it in terms of a spectrum. A lot of the times, the problem that people run across in explaining how art works, giving advice on how to create a piece of art, fiction specifically, in my case, is the trying to find some measure of objectivity, which is difficult to find in an art form. In order to explain it, in order to transmit information or give advice, people tend to default to this concept of objectivity, which is primarily irrelevant for artwork to a degree. So it's much more effective to think about it as a spectrum between. They all want my attention right now. As a spectrum between objectivity and subjectivity, and beyond that, I mean, this is where it gets kind of complicated and in need of explanation. True subjectivity, the ultimate subjectivity, is also non-dualistic. So how do you, if you want to conceive of that as a spectrum between dualism and non-dualism, it's a bit, complicated to think about that, mathematically, what that even means. So I try to simplify how to really work with that practically. I mean, that's kind of the key, is, that concept of a spectrum between non-duality and duality is kind of a complicated thing, and it's hard to imagine just abstractly how to work with that on the practical level. And so that's why I came up with the rainbow circle. At the core is the most essential function of any sort of art form, including a narrative. Right at the core, it's what you have to have in order to have art or to assess art. Right here at the core, the green center, which is you can call it a lot of different names, but I call it the ecstasy at the center, or you can call it the direct experience, the emotion of the text. How does the text stimulate a particular emotion? And it's non-dualistic in the sense that it can be positive or negative. You really assess the value of that core. Sorry, Bob. You really assess the value of that core by its intensity, not by its positivity or negativity. So you can have a great artwork that elicits strong negative emotions or strong positive emotions. And so sometimes eliciting strong negative emotions is more effective and more powerful than eliciting strong positive emotions. So that basic concept explains some of the real essential concepts of how stories work. I'm being eaten by Bo right now. Explains the basic concept of how stories work. And then it moves out from that center. That's really the core that's really necessary, is the stimulation of some sort of emotional experience, whether positive or negative, but usually strong, intense negative emotions are more powerful. Moving out from that core, I mean, if you're talking about any sort of art, that's the most essential part. Moving out from that core, you have other values that you can discuss really effectively, but they still have that essential quality at the core. And I would say for any sort of artist, the first two are really essential. For storytellers, first three are really essential. But 5, 6, 7, there are 7 circles. 5, 6, and 7, you can, also assess the relevance of those as well. So the second one, I would say, is one of the most essential, and it's a step away from that pure subjectivity towards a measure of objectivity. And I call it the paradoxical level, just because at that level, you have the idea of it's a small step of objectivity because it's a measure of contradiction from the pure core emotions. And so, this is why examples, I think, work a lot better than me just talking about it in the abstract. Because I I think that it really explains when Robin Williams' characters really work well, when he's able to really master that paradox, when he's able to master the two different levels, two or more, of course, but two different levels working in direct contention, and able to optimize the stimulation possible from having two paradoxical levels in direct contention. For Robin Williams in particular, why he functions as a good example is because when he works well, he has two really essential, identifiable qualities that are in direct contention with each other. His intense vulnerability, his intense emotion, his deep depression. That's part of the quality of Robin Williams as a person that really came to light with how he actually ended his life. And on the other side of that is the manic quality of his comedy. And so for a lot of his career, that's the aspect of his character's personalities that were really highlighted. But I think the best characters, the most effective characters that he was able to play. It's chaos here with the animals. Sorry. Really master that particular dynamic of the intense emotionality and the vulnerability. And the failed characters tended to overbalance one or the other. Usually the sentimentality. So a couple of those truisms that are poorly explained. This tends to be my frustration with the way people explain how fiction works. Most of the time is that they'll rely on some truisms that they claim something is true in all cases without actually explaining why. Siku wants to be involved. One of them is sentimentality. I have a lot of sentimentality for Siku. One of them is sentimentality. So, a lot of the failed Robin Williams characters, the criticism tends to be that they're overly sentimental. And I would say probably the two prime examples of that are What Dreams May Come and Patch Adams, for example. So somebody would look at something like What Dreams May Come, which is a fascinating movie to really contemplate because it has so many things about it that should be intensely emotional, but then just in my experience, you just watch it and it feels really flat. It should be much more intensely emotional, but it feels really, really flat. And so that's just something. He's okay. He's okay. That is something that is sort of a mystery of that movie. So many intensely emotional things going on, and really beautiful things, and really horrifying things, but they just don't hit, and it feels very superficial. So another thing that I think is really poorly explained is the notion of depth. People will say, this is bad because it lacks depth. Well, what does the depth mean? It's sort of this nebulous concept that people really fail to really explain. So they will look at something like What Dreams May Come or Patch Adams or something like that, and they'll say it really lacks depth. But what does that mean? What is the how do you actually work with it? I mean, that's part of my frustration is that if you look at something like that's overly sentimental or that lacks depth or basic complaints like that, it's not really a practical thing to work with as an author partly because it's so subjective. It's not really something you can measure really easily or effectively. But part of the complexity of highlighting this notion of being at the intensity of emotions being at the center of all other art forms is the recognition of the dismissal of things like sentimentality. So I think probably it's more effective to look at some of his more effective characters, and just really to address the issue of depth being difficult to measure. Both about to knock down the camera again. Depth being difficult to measure, I think something that is much more effective and easier to measure is duration of stimulation. So when I talk about Robin Williams' great characters, that is a very subjective thing. But a much more practical way to really determine greatness, which will always be purely subjective, but a more measurable way to really consider that is duration of stimulation. So I would like to, when talking about things like depth, I would rather replace that concept with two other concepts, one being that paradoxical concept of taking a small step outside of that, purely intense emotional experience, and another concept, duration of stimulation. So it's not how deep is a text. That's purely subjective, no real measurable quality there, but what's the duration of stimulation? So that's something that you can measure relatively. You can measure. So, if you think of something like Dead Poet Society, I mentioned already, or Good Will Hunting, which I mix up for whatever reason. If you talk about Robin Williams' great characters, those tend to be highlighted based on one really basic quality of duration of stimulation, is that we still remember them, and they're still capable of stimulating an audience. And so, it is very subjective because those are not my favorite characters of his, necessarily. So it's purely subjective, but I'm able to recognize more objectively that those two parts, for example, are more remembered and more capable of long-term stimulation than something like Patch Adams or what have you. That's either forgotten or so negatively viewed that it's not going to stimulate for very long. So duration of stimulation is much more capable of being measured. And so you can recognize qualities before something is written. You can recognize qualities that of a text that could optimize duration of stimulation. So instead of talking about something being really superficial, you can say it has weak stimulant value because it's short-term stimulation. So if you think of, big budget blockbuster movies, Michael Bay type of movies, they're capable of stimulating because they're explosions. If you see an explosion, or if you think of a horror movie, a jump scare in a horror movie, it stimulates, but it's not long-term stimulation. There's very low duration of stimulation. That is something you can measure, whereas if you just said, jump scares are bad. Well, why are they bad? No real explanation there. It's just they're bad because I dislike them, as opposed to they're bad because it's this very short-term spike in stimulation, but there's no real duration of stimulation. So a quality that makes a character much more effective in its long-term stimulation is the ability to master this paradoxical level, which Robin Williams is really able to do. So my favorite character, I'll really talk more in depth about my favorite character Robin Williams did, which is Perry from The Fisher King. Perry from The Fisher King. The Fisher King is one of my favorite movies of all time. Robin Williams, one of my favorite actors of all time. But Perry from The Fisher King has those two really essential Robin Williams qualities, and they're pretty extreme always. This is a good reason to start with his characters because, he's great at particular characters, but they're very identifiable qualities because he does take both sides to the extreme. But with Perry, if you're not familiar with the movie, The Fisher King, excellent movie, definitely watch it. He's a guy who thinks he's a knight, and he does all of these crazy things, these wacky, over-the-top things. He plays a homeless person, and it's a very ramped up version of, you know, having this delusion of grandeur. And so, you know, on one level, you look at a character like that and you say, why is it enjoyable? Well, because he's so wacky, and he's so over the top. But that particular character, the reason why he thinks that he's a knight is because he lost his wife in this very tragic, violent attack. And so he's degenerated into this delusion of grandeur, delusion of control, the ability to, you know, overcome his misery. And so you have those two parts of the character, that very vulnerable side of Robin Williams, the very, you know, intensely emotional side of Robin Williams, matched with the, you know, the opposite of it, essentially, the wacky, over the top, frenetic, wacky. Siku's trying to eat everything, because Siku loves to eat everything. And Maggie needs attention more than Siku, because they're brother and sister, and they're so jealous of each other. So anyway, as I was trying to say, don't get in my shot. This is recording my ideas about how fiction works, but also the fact that I'm drowning in mammals. Okay. Yes, I see you. You're so pretty. Okay. Where was I? So for the Fisher King, my favorite Robin Williams character, matches, so it, you know, demonstrates, you know, pretty obviously that paradox. And I would say, you know, it's not his most remembered part. Unfortunately, you know, it is my favorite part. It's not his most remembered part, but I would say, you know, it's definitely a character that you can watch over and over again, and which I did. I mean, I've watched Fisher King many, many times. You can watch it over and over again and still enjoy the part. It's funny, you know, but it's also, you know, very moving at the same time, and those two parts are really in contention with each other. And so, you know, the source of humor itself is that basic, the source of humor is that basic paradox of that superficial level of trying to maintain control in some way. And Fisher King does it really over the top. He's trying to maintain control by making himself this heroic knight character, in order to compensate for that really intense vulnerability of recognizing, you know, the mortality that comes with his wife, seeing his wife, you know, really brutally murdered. So yeah, and I would say, you know, a good well built character that's built in order for to maintain duration of stimulation, really has those two qualities in direct condition. I wouldn't say balance. I think balance is a bit over exaggerated. I wouldn't say Perry is a balanced character but creates this much more effective contention with these two parts of the personality that creates this tension that is built for a longer term stimulation than something like What Dreams May Come, which is much more intense on one side of it. You know, it's pure vulnerability, which creates, you know, it seems like it would be long-term stimulation, or it seems like it would be much more intense stimulation, because everything about that movie is just really tragic and intense, and when he goes to heaven, it's really beautiful, and all the loss that he experiences is very intensely sad. But it's functionally the equivalent of that sort of Michael Bay explosion concept of stimulation, or the jump scare. It's not built for long-term stimulation, it's built for short-term stimulation. Another effect of sentimentality, this is essentially, why does sentimentality not work? Why does What Dreams May Come not work? It essentially short circuits. So, you do have intense spikes of stimulation. You watch the heaven scenes in What Dreams May Come, and there are these spikes of stimulation, and, it's a Monet painting come to life, and, how can you not love that? But it's these intense spikes of stimulation that essentially burn themselves out or short circuit themselves and then just collapse and fall. And Monet, I think, or any sort of visual arts, I think, is a good direct comparison. If you think of duration of stimulation, sentimentality in and of itself is not a problem. And that's part of my complaint about a lot of the ways that people teach, fiction writing or how to tell stories or what have you, is that they'll say this is bad because it's sentimental, implying that sentimentality is always bad. Sentimentality works just fine in songs. It works fine in, arguably, works fine in paintings. If you look at a Monet painting, what sort of feeling do you feel from a Monet painting? Sentimentality. It's just beautiful. And there are plenty of songs that work just fine that way. If you think of, what's the best song ever written? Yesterday by the Beatles. There are, plenty of Beatles songs like that. But if you think of Yesterday is a very sentimental song. But something that's measurable about them and objectifiable about them, relatively, is that there's short-term stimulation. So you hear Yesterday for a few minutes, or you enjoy a Monet painting for a few minutes, and it works just fine. But if you take a Monet painting and you turn it into an hour-and-a-half movie, it fails. Doesn't work. You need some sort of structure at the core of it that builds a stronger foundation for longer-term stimulation within the bounds of an hour and a half. If you're writing a novel, you got to build it into the core. Even for a short story, that basic, that intense spike of emotion of something like sentimentality doesn't even work long enough to fill out, a full short story most of the time. You need some sort of paradoxical element, some sort of counterpoint, given an effective structure to work effectively for the duration of a short story, even. It can work for a poem. There are plenty of perfectly fine poems that are sentimental, arguably. But, that's... It gets more complicated with poetry, and so I'll leave that. That's not even my field at all, so I'll just leave that for another day. So if you think about other characters that are more well regarded, if you think of, like Dead Poets Society, which, I did really appreciate, when I was the right age for it, I did really appreciate the concepts that Dead Poets Society was communicating of, living for the moment and what have you. And, concepts, universal concepts, those get to the outer end of the spectrum, into the objectivity. But if you look at the character, Keating, I have cheat notes just to make sure I get all these names right. Yeah, Keating. He has that, the quality, Keating is not much of a character, really. It's all about the kids he inspires. But Keating has the quality of that frenetic, manic quality of comedy that Robin Williams works really well with, and he also communicates that vulnerability. But I think with Keating, just in retrospect, just looking back at Keating, I think he seems much more like a pathetic and powerless character to me. I mean, just as a, when I was in my teens and 20s or what have you, I found him appealing because, that's a good philosophy to live by at that age. But in retrospect, he does seem much more pathetic and vulnerable within that really conformist system. I mean, there's plenty of paradoxes that you could talk about. Robin Williams certainly has one really type of paradox down perfectly. That's what his whole career is that particular dynamic. But you can look at another type of paradox of the conformist system and the rebel. How does that play out internally? Just the drive to conform, and you can see that. I mean, the students in the Dead Poets Society have much more developed characters than Keating does, and that's sort of the dynamic playing out in them is the drive to conform versus the drive to rebel. But Keating is in this very conformist system, and he seems, kind of vulnerable, weak, pathetic on the one hand, and attempting to regain access to his own, rebelliousness that he lost in his youth. So I have a different perspective now, but that's another thing that enhances duration of stimulation. It's the idea of looking at a character from different perspectives, and it enables you to enhance stimulation over longer. It enhances the duration of stimulation. So a text that allows itself to be looked at in multiple ways will increase the duration of stimulation, because you can look at a character like Keating from very different perspectives. And Good Will Hunting, I don't really, that's the one he won his Oscar for. I don't really go back to that one. It's just not a character that appeals to me necessarily, but I think I've just seen it once. But the most famous scene is when he's talking about his dead wife once again. I mean, this is sort of Robin Williams' character that he gets pigeonholed in. But he's talking about his dead wife and farting in bed or what have you. So that whole idea of, that paradox, that contrast between something that's, could be intensely sentimental, but ends up, becoming very vulnerable at the same time as being very ridiculously, funny and what have you. So, the basic structure of most comedy is trying to maintain that facade of order, and the reason a fart joke is funny is because that breaks through the facade of maintaining order. So something like talking about your dead wife, there is an expected mannered facade of order in remaining reverent about a dead spouse, what have you. Then he talks about farts, that sort of breaks that facade. That's such a small part. Not one that I necessarily go back to. But Good Morning Vietnam is another one. He got nominated for an Oscar for that one, and that is one where it's sort of like the Keating character. I mean, he's got definitely a character that he plays a lot, but it's sort of like the Keating character, where it's a very serious situation where everybody actually is quite vulnerable to die any minute, and he's making these crazy jokes on the radio. So he's fighting with the system there, but it is once again that dynamic of vulnerability, a different kind of vulnerability in that case. Vulnerability to be killed in the middle of a war. And, his drive to rebel against the basic standards of the radio station or what have you. So that sort of contention between the very wacky comedy that he's doing versus the very serious backdrop. But just to touch on the other levels, and I would say, just as any artist, those two, working with those two are the most effective ones to really work with. Just they're the best ones to create a story out of. They're the best ones to really refine a story out of. If you're struggling with a character, think of the paradox. If something is driving the character, if the character wants something, does the character want something the opposite of it? So if you have just a wacky character, what's the what is what are those is the opposite of that? What are they hiding? What are they trying to mask about about their vulnerability? Does the wackiness come from this need to mask a vulnerability? Does the comedy come from the illusion of strength? Does it come from a weakness? Something like that really helps to effectively enhance character for longer term stimulation. If you just want a character to be wacky and that's it, that might create short term stimulation that then collapses very quickly and is forgettable. Just to touch on some of the other layers, the third layer I would say is here's the center. Here's the paradox. The third layer I would say is one of the most effective ones to work with. I don't think Robin Williams is the best example for this one. He's a great example just to see how paradox works. But just to touch on this one really briefly, it's the schematic level. So when you have that one step of objectivity away from that pure chaotic churning manic energy, intense vulnerability at the core or what have you, you have that dynamic that gives you a structure to build on. The schematic level gives you another layer of order to take all of the chaos and form it into an order, but it doesn't have to be any sort of order that exists outside of the story itself. So you can consider things like story structure. You can consider things like genre. Genre is one of the most abused words when talking about a piece of fiction, of a story, a movie, what have you. But I would say the most effective thing to really work with from this perspective of someone creating a story is to recognize audience expectations. So somebody like Robin Williams, as I said, he has a character that he frequently plays, and so by playing around with those expectations of the sort of genre he normally does, you can have an effective break from that genre. So genre is one of those things that just from it can be a shackle, it could be a bludgeon that other people use, the whole concept of genre, but it can be an effective thing to be conscious of, and conscious of what your audience is going to expect, what sort of elements of the structure of the story your audience is going to expect you to fulfill, and failure to fulfill them can be an error or it can be an effective mechanism for stimulation. So Robin Williams has plenty of characters. So if you talk about what are Robin Williams' best characters, the ones where he plays against audience expectations, where he does something outside of his type. These are not my favorites, but a lot of the times if you just ask any random person what is the best Robin Williams character, they'll talk about 1 Hour Photo. I didn't really personally like 1 Hour Photo. They'll talk about Insomnia. I didn't really like Insomnia personally. But I think both of those, a lot of the effect of the character is playing against the expectations of Robin Williams, more so than something like What Dreams May Come, and that the intensely emotional, sentimental sort of character was expected of Robin Williams, and he sort of just did half of what really works with his character, whereas characters like 1 Hour Photo or Insomnia are playing directly against the expectations. And I would say he's good in those movies. I just don't really like those movies. He's good at, I love Robin Williams and everything. Whenever he doesn't work as a character, I feel really sad for him and I cheer for him and I want him to succeed. So I'm trashing What Dreams May Come, but I just feel bad that doesn't quite work. Patch Adams, especially, I feel really bad that it failed so really badly. But I love him no matter what he does. But even if he does like bad movies, so yeah, playing against expectations. But you can also, look at movies like Hook. Hook is one of those where It failed when it came out, but it's become a cult classic. And things like cult classics, I think you can look at the development of critical responses to particular movies that critics will say that's a bad movie. Like Hook. They'll say Hook was a bad movie and it bombed or what have you. But it has duration of stimulation because people will look at that movie and they'll say, they'll have intense feelings about that movie, despite what people say at the time. There's that short-term stimulation wasn't there, but the long-term stimulation was there. But hi, how's it going? But Hook plays on partly expectations about Robin Williams as a character, but also expectations about the actual story of Peter Pan, expectations about kids' stories, expectations about fantasy stories, about pirate stories. I mean, there's so many schematic expectations in that movie that it's essentially expectations. Hey, what's up? Expectations of Steven Spielberg, expectations of all these sorts of things. It defies a lot of the expectations. And I think that's a big part of why people weren't quite sure what to really make of it. There's bad things in it. I mean, Rufio's one of those characters that, if you talk about duration of stimulation with Rufio's a character who only works in the 90s, and only works ironically any other decade, or only works if you're a kid. I certainly liked Rufio when I was a kid, but yeah, that's a really basic example. I mean, Robin Williams is not the best one to talk about with schematic considerations, because he does some. I mean, genre is the easiest way to talk about schema, but schema really works for every story. It's whatever sort of structural expectations you give to a reader. But I would say Hook is the best one to really talk about with that, because you expect Peter Pan's story to play out in a certain way, and it defies that expectation at the beginning, but it fulfills that at the end by fulfilling the expectations of a Peter Pan story. By the end, that creates a sense of stimulation. My dogs are fighting right now. By defying those expectations at the beginning, that creates a desire to resolve those needs. I mean, that's part of the issue with paradox also, is that there's a desire to resolve that tension. So if you look at dogs fighting. Okay, stop. If you look at the tension in that movie, it's the tension of Peter being this very boring sort of character, this, sort of, he forgot his Peter Pan-ness. And so the tension partly is wanting him to re-access that aspect of himself. So he's one half of the Robin Williams, and you want him to access the other half, the manic, crazy, comedy part of himself. But he's unable to really resolve that paradox, and you have the desire to resolve that paradox. And I think a lot of the problem that people have in understanding stories... Stop. A lot of the problem people have in understanding stories... Hush. is mistaking the endpoint of resolving the paradox. So, mistaking that as the purpose of the story. The purpose of the story is to resolve the paradox. That's not the purpose of the story. That's the end of the story. Once you resolve the paradox, you don't really have a story. Once Peter becomes Peter, that's one of the tensions resolved. One of the paradoxes resolved. Once he saves his family, that's another one of the bits of tension resolved. That's not the purpose of the story to resolve that tension. That's what the story is the tension of that lack of resolution. So I think that's part of where people get that mixed up. but the schema works effectively to enhance that stimulation. So schema functions, it's schema functions in order to enhance the stimulation, not the other way around. Whether fulfilling the expectations of the schema or defying the expectations of the schema, the writer must recognize which one works most effectively, either direction. That's unpleasant, sorry. Okay. Like the genre of an instructional video, does it normally have dogs fighting and hacking up something or other in the middle of them? I don't know. This is for recording for posterity, so maybe nobody will ever watch this except my children, and they'll say, "Oh, those are the dogs that that our father or grandfather loved so much." Anyway, and I don't know why he loved them, because they're crazy. Yes, I love you. Mwah. Okay. Where was I? So schema is a really important one. The other levels I don't tend to fixate on too much. I think a lot of scholars tend to fixate on the other levels. I'll just go over them real quickly. I think probably Good Morning Vietnam is the easiest one to talk about. Because you have the center is the visceral level, the ecstatic level. That's the word I usually use, and I didn't even mention that at the beginning. The visceral level, visceral stimulation, disregarding qualitative distinctions. The intensity of the visceral stimulation is the most important thing. Paradoxical level, really good for creating characters. Schema, really good for creating plots and things like that. After that, you have the psychological level. So that's really separating the external, quote-unquote, reality from the internal reactions to it. So something like Good Morning Vietnam, or something like The Fisher King. I mean, there's a lot of magical elements to The Fisher King, but it's primarily realistic. What is the actual psychological condition Perry's dealing with? You could do that with people with actual psychological conditions like Perry. You can consider, something like Good Morning Vietnam, I would say it's the easiest one to deal with, partly because it deals with an actual war. It is real. It is historical, sort of. But what is the effect of the war on? How does the external condition affect the internal condition of Robin Williams' character's response to it? Adrian's response to the war. What about the trauma of the war drives him to do this crazy radio show or what have you? And then you move into the realistic level. I've had plenty of people bludgeon me with that particular level, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it's just the idea that Good Morning Vietnam represents this actual war that happened. And then you move into the representational level, so what sort of universals does it really represent? War always causes people to go crazy or whatever. War always, whatever sort of universal you want to talk about. Men's inhumanity to man, which is a terrible phrase, but I always hear that. But this story represents man's inhumanity to man. Terrible phrase on so many levels. However, that's the sort of thing that you associate with that second to last level, which is the idea that any sort of text about war, any sort of movie about war, is about the nature of inhumanity. Why are we so inhumane to one another? What is the source of war? How can we stop wars from happening? That sort of thing. And then the last level is the rhetorical, so it's the argument that the text is making for how to stop war or what have you. We should just laugh instead of going to war or what have you. Which, those levels are fine. I don't tend to talk about them because I don't find them really practical to use. I think they're moving away from that core visceral stimulation. But if you think of an example like Good Morning Vietnam, that really only works as a story effectively if you have those first two layers really effective. And that's why I would say those two layers work best for any sort of storytelling. If you have a character who's feeling really intense emotions that you can attach to if you structure it so that it most effectively transmits. So using things like paradox or in schema to really optimize the stimulation. Those are the really important parts for any sort of story, whether it has to do with any sort of political issue or not. Whether it has to do with the Vietnam War, or whether it has to do with, homelessness. I mean, Fisher King, a lot of it is about homelessness and people being inhumane to homeless people and that sort of thing. Lots and lots of stuff in there. It's totally valid to look at something like Fisher King in terms of what does it say more universally about this real situation of homelessness? What does it argue for the solution to homelessness? Perfectly valid ways to approach it. But as a storyteller, the starting point that I would recommend is, Perry. What is Perry feeling? How do you really effectively structure Perry as a character in order to, whether or not the whole message about homelessness actually transmits, can you really effectively optimize the stimulation, the sympathy, the empathy for Perry as a character? Are you transmitting that empathy in such a way that it will spike stimulation? Speaking of Spike, here's my cat Spike. He might not jump on my lap. So I've had 4 mammals in this particular video. Boots is not going to come out. So I have another cat named Boots. He's not going to come out. But is it spiking the stimulation briefly and so that it fizzles out or it short circuits in some way? Is it overly sentimental? And that's a big problem with a lot of really rhetorical pieces. Like if you write something from the perspective of saying, I'm going to highlight the tragedy of homelessness. I'm going to have this homeless character who's very miserable, and it will elicit this sympathy in the audience in order to fight homelessness or what have you. Those are great intentions. Those are fantastic. But it's more likely to succeed if you start with optimizing the stimulation by creating a paradoxical character. So a character who's not, just intensely one emotion that's going to short circuit the reader. And that's not really the part I'm too interested in. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that any sort of writer, if you want to highlight the misery of homelessness, or if you don't, if you just want to tell a good story, you look at those, center parts of the story. Spike might make a visit after all. Here, Spike. There you go. Okay. So I've had all 4 on camera. Hi, Spike. Hi, Spike. The paradox of these characters is that they're very cute, which is sentimental. That's Spike stimulation really briefly. But they're also devils who fight each other and tear up everything and are menaces. But anyway, so that being said, I think that covers probably the main Robin Williams characters I really wanted to talk about. Those are the ones that work best as examples. I mean, Jumanji is another good one to talk about. It's not really a typical Robin Williams character. I'm not sure why he was cast in it. He's great in it, but it's not really a typical character. But it's very schematic because there is a definite rule system. It's very much intrinsic to the story itself. It's not a genre. It's just a rule system for, it's a fantasy adventure or whatever, but it's a rule system that the movie establishes at the beginning, and they stick with it consistently. So it's very... He chewed this up. Speaking of them being devils, he chewed up this notebook. Oh, there it is. He chewed up this notebook. You can see why Robin Williams is one of my heroes, is the manic inability to focus. Where was I? Yeah, Jumanji establishes the rule system right from the beginning. So that's a good basic example of that. Though I wouldn't say Alan Parrish is really the best character. He's a little kid who becomes this jungle warrior. I mean, there's the paradox there, but I don't know if Robin Williams specifically taps into that really effectively. I wanted to mention that, but I'm not going to cover every single one. But anyway, that's about it. I'll be back with another video about what? I don't know. Probably with just as many mammals in the video. Make sure to smash that like button. Like and subscribe. Support me on Patreon. I don't have a Patreon, but, support me on Patreon. Or if you want to. And bye.